Every morning, before the world stirred awake, Sarah Evans arrived at Dwayne Johnson's home. She stepped through the front doors as the sun's first light cast soft shadows through the grand windows. In silence, she moved with purpose, wiping down counters, fluffing pillows, dusting furniture that never sat untouched for long. It was work she took pride in, meticulous, precise, unseen yet essential. To those who passed her by, Sarah was simply part of the house, another worker in a long line of staff who ensured everything remained immaculate. She never interrupted, never imposed, never strayed from the role she had been given. If she was exhausted, she never showed it. If her hands ached from long hours, she never complained. To the world inside that home, she was reliable, present, familiar. Dwayne Johnson knew her name. He greeted her when he passed through the kitchen, exchanged a smile when their paths crossed in the hallway. He noticed her in the same way he noticed the paintings on his walls, always there, always constant. But he never really saw her. Not until the night that changed everything. Sarah Evans spent her days moving to the grand halls of Dwayne Johnson's home, tending to the details no one noticed unless they were forgotten. She dusted the bookshelves lined with awards, polished the floors that gleamed under the chandeliers, and made sure the windows framed the world outside without a single smudge. It was a job she did with quiet dedication. She never rushed, never cut corners, never let fatigue slow her down. She was always the first to arrive, long before the family woke, and the last to leave, ensuring everything was set for the next day. She listened to conversations from a distance, the sound of laughter echoing through the halls. She never interrupted, never intruded. Sarah did not share much about herself. When asked about her weekend, she kept her answers brief. She smiled, nodded, and quickly returned to her work. It was easy that way. There were no complaints, no signs of struggle, nothing to make anyone question what happened after she left for the night. She had long ago learned how to keep her world separate from the one she worked in. But the weight of that secret followed her, heavy on her shoulders, pressing it on her every moment of every day. Sarah had no home. When the sun set and the house grew quiet, when the voices that filled the rooms faded into the night, she did not drive away to a warm bed, to a place where she could unwind from the day. Instead, she walked to her car, parked at the far end of the estate, away from the security cameras, where no one would look twice. She climbed into the back seat, carefully arranging her few belongings, her work clothes neatly folded beside her, a small bag of essentials tucked into the footwell. She pulled a blanket over her shoulders, the same blanket that kept her warm every night for the past year. She told herself it was temporary. She told herself it would change soon. But as the weeks turned to months, it became harder to believe. She never wanted anyone to know. She worked harder than ever, made sure she was never seen lingering, never appeared anything less than strong. If exhaustion wore at her bones, she masked it behind habit. If hunger clawed at her stomach, she ignored it until the next meal. If the loneliness crept in, she drowned out with work. She was invisible in all the ways that mattered. Until one evening, when everything changed. Dwayne Johnson had never questioned why she was always there before anyone else. Never wondered why she seemed to avoid conversations about her life outside work. Never noticed the way she carried herself, always careful, always measured. That night, as he stepped outside for some air, he glanced toward the far end of the driveway. A car sat parked in the shadows, the same car he had seen every morning. His eyes narrowed, curiosity settling in his mind. It was late, too late for anyone to still be here. He took a few steps forward, his gaze fixing on the vehicle. And then, through the faint glow of the streetlight, he saw movement, the shift of a figure beneath a blanket, a weary hand adjusting a pillow, the slow rise and fall of breath. Sarah, his breath stilled for a moment, the woman who had cleaned his home for over a year, who had moved through his life like a steady presence, had been sleeping outside his house all along. He stood there frozen, realization sinking deep, and in that moment, something inside him shifted. The next morning, Sarah would arrive at work as she always did. She would pick up a cloth, straighten a chair, begin her day as though nothing had changed. But everything had, because for the first time, Someone had seen her, and by the time the sun set again, her life would never be the same. Asterisk. Dwayne Johnson had always trusted his instincts. Years in the wrestling ring, years in Hollywood, years of reading people he knew when something was off. That morning, he noticed something different about Sarah. Her routine was the same. She arrived early, worked with the same quiet focus, moved through the house as she always had. But there was something about her silence that morning that held his attention longer than usual. He asked how her weekend had been. It was a simple question, one he had asked dozens of times before. Sarah smiled, nodded, and gave a brief reply, something about running errands, keeping busy. It was the way she said it, the way her hand stilled for just a second longer than usual, how she reached for a dish towel even though there was nothing to clean. A small hesitation, barely noticeable. But Dwayne noticed. He didn't press. He let it go, but the thought followed him for the rest of the day. It lingered as he sat in his office, replaying their brief exchange. He tried to shake it off. She was private, that much he knew. She had always been this way. But something told him this was different. That night, long after the rest of the house had gone quiet, Dwayne stepped outside for some air. The cool breeze drifted through the trees, carrying the distant sounds of traffic from the highway beyond his property. He let out a slow breath, his mind still occupied with thoughts of the day, when something in the distance caught his eye. A car, parked at the far end of the driveway. The same car he had seen that morning. The same car he had seen every morning. He frowned. It wasn't parked where the staff usually left their cars. It was tucked away, as if placed there deliberately, away from the usual spaces. He took a step forward, then another, his curiosity pushing him toward it, though he couldn't explain why. As he got closer, the dim glow of a street lamp cast just enough light through the windshield for him to see what was inside. A small bag, a pair of folded clothes, a blanket draped over the back seat, and then, beneath that blanket movement, his feet stopped, his breath stilled. Sarah. She was curled in the back seat, her head resting against a makeshift pillow, her body barely shifting as she breathed. She wasn't waiting for someone. She wasn't taking a break. She was sleeping, right there, just outside his home. Dwayne stood there for what felt like a long time, his mind struggling to piece together what he was seeing. He had known her for over a year. She had been in his home nearly every day. And all that time, she had been living in her car. The realization settled in, heavier than he expected. He could have walked away, could have pretended he hadn't seen anything, but he knew that was impossible. Once you see something like that, you can't unsee it. And Dwayne Johnson was not a man who ignored what needed to be done. The next morning, Sarah would walk into his house, just as she always did. She would start her work without hesitation, carrying the same quiet strength she always had. But today would be different, because today, someone had finally seen her, and by the end of the day, her world would never be the same. Dwayne Johnson was a man of action. He had spent his life overcoming obstacles, pushing through challenges, and standing up when others needed him. But this was not a scene from a movie, not a scripted moment where the hero rushes in with dramatic music swelling behind him. This was real, and this was someone he knew, someone he had walked past every day, exchanged pleasantries with, but had never truly seen until now. As he stepped away from Sarah's car that night, his decision was already made. He wouldn't wait. He wouldn't ask her to explain. He wouldn't give her a chance to refuse his help. By morning, everything would be different. Dwayne rose before the sun, his mind clear, his steps purposeful. He made phone calls, set things in motion, ensured that by the time Sarah arrived for work, the wheels had already turned. The first part of his plan was simple. She would not clean his house that day. When Sarah walked through the doors, her movements were as they always were, precise, efficient, silent. She had no idea that today was unlike any other. Dwayne was waiting for her in the kitchen, leaning against the counter, a set of keys in his hand. She hesitated when she saw him. He never waited for her, never stood still this early in the morning. "Sarah," he said, his voice steady, "come with me." She glanced at the keys in his hand, then at his face, searching for an answer. "Sir, He shook his head. Just come. She followed him, though uncertainty sat heavy in her steps. Out the front doors, past the driveway, toward a different car, one she had never seen before. He stopped in front of it, turned to her, and extended the keys. This is yours now. Sarah froze. The words did not register at first. The car was sleek, clean, nothing like the aging vehicle she had been sleeping in. She shook her head before she could speak. I can't accept this. You already have. Tears welled in her eyes before she could stop them. For the first time in a long time, she had no words. She looked down at the keys in her trembling hands, disbelief weighing heavier than the metal. You're not sleeping in a car anymore, Sarah. Dwayne's voice was firm, leaving no room for argument. And you're not just getting a car. You're getting a home. Sarah's breath caught. The air around her felt thick. The world suddenly too large, too overwhelming. A home, she whispered. He nodded, fully furnished, ready for you to move in today. She shook her head again, as if that would undo what was happening, as if denying it would make it any less real. I don't understand why you're doing this. Dwayne's voice softened. Because you deserve it. She covered her mouth with her hands, her body shaking from the weight of emotion she had held in for too long. Gratitude, relief, disbelief, years of struggle unraveling. In an instant, she looked at him, her vision blurred with tears, and for the first time in her life, she allowed herself to believe that kindness could be this real, that someone had seen her, truly seen her, and decided that she mattered enough to help. Dwayne placed a hand on her shoulder. Take the day off. Go see your home. Sarah nodded, unable to speak. As she slid into the driver's seat of her new car, she gripped the steering wheel as if it were the most solid thing she had ever held. And for the first time in a long time, she let herself exhale. Dwayne watched as she pulled out of the driveway, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. He had done a lot in his life, won titles, starred in blockbuster films, built an empire. But this was something that mattered. A few minutes later, Sarah walked into her new home. The air smelled clean, untouched, waiting for her presence to make it whole. She walked through the rooms, fingers tracing over furniture she didn't have to fight to keep. A kitchen stocked with food, a bedroom with fresh sheets, a living room where she could sit and breathe without the weight of uncertainty pressing down on her. And when she finally sat down, when the shock settled just enough for reality to sink in, she covered her face with her hands and wept. She wept because, for the first time in years, she felt safe. She wept because she was home. Sarah Evans sat in her new home, the weight of reality settling in. The air around her was quiet, but not the kind of quiet she had grown used to. This wasn't the stillness of sleeping in a car, where every sound outside put her on edge. This wasn't the silence of exhaustion, where the only thing left to do was push forward, pretend everything was fine, and hope for something better. This was different. This was peace. For the first time in years, Sarah had a place of her own, a door that locked from the inside, not the other way around, a bed that didn't require adjusting the backseat of a car, a kitchen stocked with food she didn't have to ration. She walked through the room slowly, her fingers brushing over furniture, the framed pictures on the wall, the soft fabric of the couch. Every detail told her the same thing: she belonged here. This was not a temporary fix. This was her home. She had spent so long convincing herself she could handle everything alone. She had made peace with the exhaustion, the uncertainty, the endless cycle of working just to survive. She never wanted pity. She never asked for help. But Dwayne had seen her, had truly seen her, and in doing so, had changed her life in a way she never could have imagined. Dwayne never made a speech about it. He never looked for recognition. He never once acted as though he had done something extraordinary. When asked about it later, he shrugged and simply said it was the right thing to do. Sarah wasn't the only one impacted. Word spread through the community, through his fans, through people who had followed his career for years. This was different from the big gestures, different from the flashy donations and the publicized charity work. This was personal, and that made all the difference. People who had never thought twice about the workers in their lives. The cashier at the grocery store, the janitor who cleaned their office, the woman who changed their hotel sheets began to pay attention. They looked closer. They asked questions. They took time to notice, to see beyond the surface. Sarah Evans was just one person, but her story became something bigger. It became a reminder of how easy it is to overlook someone, to assume they're fine because they do not complain. And more importantly, it became proof that a single act of kindness, one moment of truly seeing someone, could change a life forever. Months later, Sarah sat down for an interview. The cameras were rolling, but she barely noticed them. She was no longer the woman who hid her struggles behind a smile, no longer the woman who slept in her car and pretended she wasn't exhausted. She looked directly into the lens, her voice steady. I thought I had to do it alone. I thought struggling was just something I had to accept. Then someone saw me, and for the first time in a long time, I wasn't invisible. A pause, a small smile. I hope someone watching this chooses to see the people around them, because sometimes that's all it takes. Dwayne Johnson never asked for credit. He never wanted recognition. He simply acted, and in doing so, he reminded the world of a truth so simple, yet so often forgotten. Heroes don't always wear capes. Sometimes they just choose to help when no one else does. This story is not just about generosity. It is about what happens when we take the time to see people really see them. Sarah Evans never asked for help. She carried her burdens alone because she believed there was no other way. And for too long, no one noticed. Not because they didn't care, but because they never stopped to look. Dwayne Johnson did. He could have ignored what he saw that night. He could have walked past that car and convinced himself it wasn't his concern. Instead, he made a choice to act, to change someone's life, to remind the world that kindness is more than words. It is action. How many times do we walk past someone who is struggling? How often do we assume that because someone smiles, because they show up and do their job, because they never ask for help, that they must be okay? What if they aren't? The power of the story is not just in what Dwayne did for Sarah. It is in the reminder that any of us can do the same. You don't need to be famous. You don't need endless resources. Sometimes all it takes is paying attention, asking a question, showing up when someone least expects it. So now the question is, will you? Will you take a moment today to notice someone who might be struggling? Will you ask the co-worker who always stays late how they're really doing? Will you acknowledge the cashier who never meets your eyes? Will you check in on the neighbor who keeps to themselves? It costs nothing to care, but to the person receiving it, it could mean everything. If this story moved you, if it made you think, if it reminded you of the goodness that still exists in the world, don't let it end here. Comment below and share your thoughts. Have you ever witnessed an act of kindness that changed someone's life? Have you ever been on the receiving end of generosity that you never saw coming? Your story might inspire someone else to act. Like this video if you believe in everyday heroes. Subscribe if you want to hear more real-life stories that remind us of the power of compassion. And most importantly, share this video. Because somewhere out there, someone needs to hear this. Someone who thinks they are alone. Someone who needs to be reminded that people still care. Because kindness, real kindness, doesn't just change one life. It creates a ripple effect. And it starts with you.